EMF, EMI is a stressor. Psychological stress, physical stress, thermal stress, electrical stress. I think the endpoint's all the same. The cancer rates and the so-called diseases of civilization rates just paralleled electrification, chapter and verse. It's just striking data. And I tell you what, it's getting worse.
It's likely you may not realize that a large percentage of the disease that we face in modern civilization is related to an artifact of electricity. Hi, this is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we are joined by Sam Milham, who is really a pioneer in the understanding of what's conventionally called dirty electricity. In fact, he wrote a book by that title. But I think a more precise definition would be EMI, or electrical field interference. Dr. Milham is a MD and an epidemiologist. Actually, that was an area of pursuit that I had considered following, but decided just to go straight through my family practice residency. But he's done decades and decades of pioneering research. And in his book, which is pretty much an autobiography of sorts, he details and discusses the extensive journey he took to help uncover this link between this artifact of electrical distribution, this dirty electricity, and its connection to so many diseases. And we'll discuss also how this impacts at the core, the foundation, which we're coming to appreciate is really of all disease, which is mitochondrial function. So welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Milham.
Well, my pleasure.
So now you actually attended the Albany, New York Medical School. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's where you got you went to your undergraduate there too. And you had quite a bit of a journey. You got your MPH, your Master's of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. And then you became board certified in public health and went to Washington and Hawaii, I believe, and then came back to the States. So perhaps you can summarize your journey in the process. You detail quite a bit in your book, but I think our viewers would be really interested in your background to place this into a context of what we're going to discuss.
Oh, well, I really got interested in medicine way back in college. I went to Union College in Schenectady, New York, and I had a job working weekends. I ran a lab in a small Catholic hospital, and so I got to see draw blood from patients and start IVs, and hung around a pathologist and learned about disease. And the thing that struck me was I was more interested in why they were there than what to do once they got there. Mm-hmm. So when I after medical school. It's kind of an accident that I got into epidemiology. When I showed up for my internship at the U.S. Public Health Service in Massachusetts, almost all the residencies were spoken for already. And the one that was open was epidemiology, so I took it. And I've never regretted it for a second. I was always interested in the science of disease. And so that's how I got started.
Well, okay, thank you for that historical perspective. And how old are you now?
I'll be 85, May 12.
Well, congratulations, because it's very clear from our brief conversation that your brain is working the way it was designed to, that you are not impaired by many of the degenerative diseases that impact so many people at that age, where you can see it very clearly in your speech patterns, but your brain seems to be working pretty well. I suspect in a good part because you've been avoided this artifact of dirty electricity. So let's talk about dirty electricity. How is it generated, and what is it specifically?
Okay, well the electric grid began with Edison in 1892 at the Pearl Street generating station, and it turns out that from the very second he started generating electricity, he was making dirty electricity. And the way I know that is because if you read he's got tons of publications. And he had a big problem with his original generators, these big jumbos, and they had brush arcing. You know, the way they make electricity is they spin magnets and have brushes to pick up their contact points. All electric motors have brushes, and generators have them. They're made out of graphite. But he tried to solve the problem by dumping mercury into his motors, his generators. But that made everybody sick. But just by the fact that he had this extensive brush arcing, I know that his original electricity, and from then till now, has suffered from some sort of brush arcing. And arcing and sparking makes dirty electricity, which is really high frequency electric transients. They come and go, they're spiky, they have very short latency times. And so from the outset of the grid, we're being exposed to this business. And it's not the 60 cycle stuff. That we're talking frequencies up in the kilohertz and higher frequencies, thousands of cycles a second.
So does it actually go into the megahertz range, or does it stop at the high kilohertz?
Oh, well, I think it goes higher, but it seems the kilohertz range is what really is getting us, making us sick.
Yeah, and just so you know, if you are if you currently have photovoltaic panels or solar panels in your home in an effort to generate clean electricity, I've had 15 kilowatts of panels for the last 5 years, and that's great. But what you probably don't understand is that those photovoltaic panels generate DC current, which is essentially unusable in most homes. So what you need to do is use an inverter that converts it to AC current. And this is a phenomenal source of dirty electricity. So if you have solar panels, or you know someone that does, you need to let them listen to this interview and understand that they need to remediate it. So I remediated mine and tested it, and it's fine now, but it will cause dirty electricity, which will cause problems.
Yeah, but the other problem with that is the big commercial solar arrays, they have inverters, thousands of them if they're big arrays, and they all make dirty electricity. So if your utility has got an appreciable wind or solar component, it's by definition giving you dirty electricity.
Wow, that's a very good point. I hadn't considered the commercial aspect, and there are islands, the entire island is being generated by solar electricity. And Kauai, which is of course one of the US states, or a subsection of the US states of the Hawaiian Islands, is planning within the next 10 or 20 years to have their entire island be generated. But they've got, I think, a few hundred megawatt systems that are out there now generating a significant portion, and they store it in the batteries. But you're right, it has to be converted. You can store it as DC current in the batteries, but ultimately that's useless in our current system. It didn't have to be, but we chose to operate on AC currents. And if we didn't have that interconversion, it wouldn't be an issue. So this is a big issue if you have solar panels, or if your utility is generating electricity through the use of either wind or solar. So thank you for that consideration.
Well, another little anecdote. When I first discovered this business, I got online and I studied and looked up the commercial sources of photovoltaic inverters, the companies that sell these, and I found this wonderful statement at the end of this list of 1,000 of these things that they were selling. It said, all photovoltaic inverters create AM radio interference. What does that tell you? It says they're all dirty.
Yeah. So as we're talking about dirty electricity, but as I said earlier, the other term is EMI.
That's right.
Or electromagnetic interference, which is a more precise definition. Dirty is sort of a lay term, but that's what it is. It's electromagnetic interference, and that classic example is this AM radio wave transmission interruption. So why should we be concerned about EMI in our homes? I mean, so what does it matter? What's the big deal?
The big deal is that over the 40 years I've been doing this business, it's become super clear that the EMI, or dirty electricity, is very biologically active, and it's just, and I wrote the book to basically warn the population, because nobody seemed to pay attention to it, is that this is the major cause of all the so-called diseases of civilization. We're talking everything: cardiovascular disease, all the cancers, and even suicide, which really caught my eye. When I looked at the causes of death in this country, the only cause that wasn't linked to it was auto accidents, basically.
Yeah, I am sure that it's a contribution, and I'm actually becoming passionate about this. I've known about dirty electricity, or EMI, for a decade or longer, maybe 2 decades, but I've never really fully appreciated the impact it had until I read your book, and the light started to kick on. And for the last year or so, I've been immersing myself in the literature of mitochondrial function, and I think that's the way that it impacts its effects. So ultimately, it's mediated through some component, but I do believe there's other variables that contribute to the diseases that you mentioned that can't be overlooked, such as the processing of food, the food selection, the contamination with toxins like glyphosate. And then we also there's other types of non-native EMF exposure that I think it's important to ground people of. There's basically 3. One is magnetic, which this is not. The other is electrical, which what this is, EMI. And then the third is microwaves, which is not your microwave oven necessarily, although that's a form, but it really is the communication that the cell phones and your routers and your portable phones. So those are all 3. And what we're talking today is about the electrical component. All of them contribute to it. And I think they have probably similar mechanisms. And I was reading a research paper today, actually, and I don't know if you've encountered this before, but some of the speculation is that well, I'll let you talk about it first, but I'll talk about some of the biological mechanisms, is that these peaks, this electromagnetic interference within your circuits, actually extends out how far? 6, 10, 20 feet, and it resonates with your biology, and that activates the biological changes.
Look, as long as we're talking about inverters and you got into microwaves, all transmitters, AM, FM, and especially cell towers, your cell phone works because there's a transmitter out there that transmits to you. They all run on DC. So every cell tower in the world has a huge inverter in it to make the DC to run the transmitter, and also to charge the backup batteries. And they make dirty electricity by the ton. And I studied a school that had lots of schools have cell towers on campus, and what they're doing is they're bathing the kids, and it gets back into the wires, the power wires that service it. And so the grid becomes an antenna for all this dirty electricity, and it extends miles downstream. And the way you can get a distance figure is there's a clever study done in Brazil where they looked at deaths from cancer by distance of residence from the base of the cell tower, and they got effects out to 500 meters. That's 1,500 feet. And I'll tell you, the cell tower can't talk that far. It's the dirty electricity, the EMI in the grid, and the wires running into your house through the ground and through your power cords that's doing it. So
okay, so obviously it needs to connect to your biology in some way, and it does that when it's on a circuit. Because say you had a solar panel in your house, not all the circuits will be hooked up to that. It's only the circuits that are hooked up to that inverter that are going to be influenced by this. And actually, if you have solar panels, this isn't an issue at night because there's no sun out, so it's not going to generate this interference. But once it's generating it, how far away do you have to be from that wire to actually resonate with that frequency and have it transmit into your body?
Oh, well, actually, you can be quite far from it. But what happens is, I studied this in a condo I owned in California, which was built on a slab. Well, let's back up a little bit. About 3 years ago, Marty Graham, who with Professor Graham, who recently died a couple of years ago, and Stetzer, who basically pioneered and studied this whole field and trained me, and he got me started with a small grant. He sent me an off-the-shelf Fluke multimeter, measures, volts, amps, ohms. And he showed me how to use it to measure current in my body. And that's been a mind blower. In fact, I got 2 papers in press now that look at it. I put an EKG patch on my chest for one lead of the thing, and the other thing goes to an outlet ground or a true ground. And I drive a stake in the ground, and it measures the current that's in my body. And I find that just walking on the pavement in an area, I can get very, very high and probably, carcinogenic fields of current in my body.
What types of voltages are you experiencing? Are you measuring?
Well, we're talking millivolts, but
Millivolts.
but we're also talking microamps. Now, the EPRI and their people have written extensively on contact currents, and NIHS has studied this years ago, and they conclude that 18 microamps is sufficient to put enough current in your body, voltage in your body, to give you cancer with a chronic exposure. Well, hell, I find 200-300 microamps lots of places, just standing on the floor.
So that Fluke multimeter is able to measure that for you. All you do is hook it up to an EKG electrode anywhere on your body.
Yeah, well, in fact, that exactly. But what I do is I got tired of ripping the hair off my chest with the EKG pad, so I just stick it in my mouth.
Okay. Oh, one of the leads on the Fluke multimeter.
Yeah, right. And the other one goes out.
It goes into the ground.
Right.
Electrical ground. You're fine.
Right.
And then you look and you measure microamps and millivolts.
Microamps coursing through my body, and what the real mind blower was when I got it like this. I'm sitting at a Hewlett Packard laptop, and I was measuring myself, and I just touched the case of the laptop and found out it was putting 80 microamps into my body. I finally got rid of it by putting a USB to an outlet ground. And that fixes it. You can buy those if you find out yours is bad. The other horrendous.
Well, many of the notebooks, if they have power supplies that are grounded, that tends to solve the problem too. But a lot of them aren't. I think the Apples are not grounded. Well,
this one isn't grounded, but when I grounded it, it's fine. But the other thing I notice is that almost all light, non-incandescent lighting, puts the current into your body just directly from the light.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow, and you've measured that on the Fluke.
Absolutely.
It's not surprising because we've had a physician, Andrew Wunsch, Dr. Wunsch, who is a German photobiologist who goes into just from a biological light perspective, but I didn't realize it had electrical implications also. That's interesting.
Well, what it just explains a ton. I started doing occupational mortality stuff, 30 years ago, and my contribution is still online. You can look at Washington State mortality for every cause, every occupation. And I was always puzzled why the highest cancer rates of all the occupations are teachers and professors and office workers. Why is melanoma more common in people who work indoors than outdoors? Why is it more common in teachers and professors than it is in lifeguards or farmers? And why do you get it on parts of your body that never see the sun? It's due to this. It's due to EMF. And as I've been measuring schools and colleges, and hey, wow, I'm telling you, it's just no place to hide.
Well, let me just give a bit of clarification, because EMF would also include healthy biological sunlight. So there are healthy EMFs. So this is non-native artificial EMFs that are the source of the problem. But what I'd like you to go on is describe some of the research that you did, some of the pioneering your work, especially in I believe the California school system, where you were called out to find out a series of, I believe, 13 teachers who had contracted cancer, and the reluctance that you encountered from the school board and the system there that didn't want your input, it didn't want your help at all. And it actually was the teachers themselves who were pleading with you to help them solve this issue. And that how you discovered that male breast cancer is actually a sentinel for EMF exposure, just like mesothelioma is a sentinel for asbestos exposure.
That's true, and I can't make anybody believe it. In fact, the second edition of my book, I comment woefully that there was an epidemic of male breast cancer at Camp Lejeune in Marine Corps. So I wrote to them and said, hey, look at this, 15 studies that link EMF to this. They were saying it was due to drinking water contamination. There's no way it's due to EMF for sure. And but they just ignored me, and in fact they got federal money to take the sting out of their problems. And it's just it just boggles my mind how politics and money and greed overwhelm everything.
Well, your experience in the California school system was quite a powerful anecdotal illustration of that. So I wonder if you could expand on it now and share that with our viewers.
Well, right after I moved down there, there was an article in the Desert Sun paper. It's published in Palm Springs, and these teachers had called in had told their school system that they were certain that they had an epidemic of cancer in a middle school, McKinton Middle School. Well, the teachers are smart. They knew teachers at other schools, and they recognized that 13 of them had developed cancer, and they didn't know of another school in the whole system with more than 2 or 3. So they complained to the superintendent of the schools, and she hired a guy from the local cancer registry who came and spent 2 hours telling them it was all in their head and that it was due to sunshine. And when I read the article, I went to my computer and looked up how big the school was, and I knew right away that they were right. They had a beef. So I tried for about 4 or 5 months to contact the school. I kept writing and I got no answers. Finally, I went to the superintendent, and she said, well, that we're satisfied with our expertise, with our expert advice from
the utility company. The utility company.
Basically, he might as well be a utility company. But anyway, so I went to the newspaper and told them, hey, look, here's my name and phone number. If the teachers are interested, I'll take a look at this with them. So I did that, and but basically, we did get into the school just two consecutive nights, and then shortly after that, I was accused of criminal trespass by the school district. They didn't want me in there, and it was just like pulling teeth. We got the study done without any help from the school. They could have helped us by giving us teachers' rosters and stuff. We did it all just with the teachers' help and with some classroom assignment rosters that one of the teachers had saved. And I think it's and the real proof of the pudding is that it's been out there for nearly 10 years. Nobody's been able to shoot it down.
And when you say out there, you mean published in peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Yeah, American Journal of Industrial Medicine. And the other thing about it that's so right on, it's unbelievable, is we only had 18 total cancers when we were done, but 3 of them had risk ratios about 10, which you almost never see. And with just power frequencies, you get 2s and 3s. And the 3 cancers that we found that were high in these teachers were identically elevated in the big California Teachers Association study. That can't happen by chance. Mm-hmm. So I've contacted the Teachers Association. They stonewalled me too. And I did another school. I tried to do another school. Had a cell tower on campus and an epidemic, mostly breast cancer in the staff. And once again, they hired Lika Kaifetz to come to a school board meeting and try to shoot down my stuff. And so they wouldn't cooperate. So what are you going to do? You can lead these people to water, but you can't make them drink.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the science of epidemiology, there couldn't be a better suited discipline, scientific discipline, to evaluate this, because they really carefully study populations and statistics and see if there's any significant correlation or connection to these causal factors. So this is the type of scientist you want to evaluate, and it's really somewhat incredulous, but not unreasonable to find out that there's been this rejection of this type of work because of the influence of the traditional industries that would be impaired by accepting this type of approach and really ascribing any health damage to exposure to these types of fields. So there's a strong negative incentive for the really against spreading this type of information. But what intrigued me too is that when you did your initial analysis, because when as a scientist, you're going to do some historical review first, and when you studied the literature, you found a pretty strong correlation with electrification and mortality with some adult cancers, including female breast cancer. It dates back to the 30s and 40s. We're talking, 70, 80 years ago. So maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, hey, actually, dates back to 1900. I was amazed. If you look at longevity, well, what happened in this country that was really unusual, it's so big and the electrification is so expensive, wire generators, et cetera, that Edison had this great idea. And by the turn of the century, almost all the big cities in the world had electricity. The rural areas in this country didn't finally catch up to the cities till mid-50s. So you had half a century with two huge populations covered by a good vital record system, deaths, births, etc. And one was exposed to electricity and the other wasn't. If you compare those two populations, the differences are just amazing. At the turn of the century, if you lived in New York City or most of the other cities in the country, your longevity, average life expectancy was low 50s. If you were Amish, who didn't use electricity, or if you lived out in the Tules, like rural Mississippi, or rural New York State for that matter, your longevity was up in the 70s. So then if you fast forward to 1930s, well, actually, even within the 20s, I found in one of the vital statistics books, one of the guys who put it together, this is all deaths in USA, noticed that the urban cancer excess was 58% higher than the rural cancer mortality. I mean, that's, wow. I mean, it's enough to blow your mind. So it was all internally consistent. And this has been going on since Edison.
So that's one of your skill sets, is that you can look through these data sets and extract this type of information that wasn't really well known, and because no one was looking for it. I mean, why would they think to even look for an association between electrical use and mortality or these types of diseases? But you did that. You analyzed it and you came up with these results and you published them.
That's why I wrote the book. I mean, when I saw that, well, I went in looking at, I started with childhood leukemia. That's a great disease to study because the peak incidence is age 2 and 3. If they're going to die, in the old days, they all died. You had good access, a good diagnosis. It's a hard diagnosis to miss in a small kid. Just do a blood test and finger stick and you have it. So when I got into looking in the national data set, I was astonished that it wasn't just leukemia, it was all cancers. It was cardiovascular disease and suicide. The suicide data is just beautiful. And you could just see you have as electrification proceeded, thank God the census in 20, 30, and 40, they asked whether the house was hooked to the grid. And if you look at that state by state or farm by farm, you can track electrification. And the cancer rates and the so-called diseases of civilization rates just paralleled electrification chapter and verse. It's just striking data. And I tell you what, it's getting worse. And it's getting worse. And right now it's getting worse in this country compared to other countries because of ground currents. Mm-hmm. The utilities in this, well, we can get into the grid in this country is called the grounded Y grid, and in Europe they don't have it, and it was designed for lightning protection, etc. But now, about 80% of the current that's delivered to loads, to your house, to your business, returns to the substations via the earth, and now they they have 4 ground contacts per mile when there used to be 1. And every transformer I've checked has got a wire running from the center tap of the pole-mounted transformer or the ground transformer to the ground. So, and the dairy farmers were first to pick this up. They picked it up in the 70s, and they noticed their cows were dying and weren't given milk, wouldn't reproduce. And it turns out that this big old Bossy is a wonderful canary in the coal mine for EMF. And Stetzer and Graham and others did a wonderful study. And they parsed out what parts of the EMF spectrum are impacting milk production in the cow. Here, they measure the milk every day or every other day in cow, how much she makes. And they know to the pound her milk production and her health, if she's got mastitis or whatever else, or pus production. They do cell counts in milk. And Stetzer and they published a wonderful paper showing which harmonics, multiples of 60 are the bad ones, and how the transients affect the milk production. So, we got good animal work. You don't have to use rats. We got big cow work, and they had it for 60 years, and it's getting worse. And the Amish are just a wonderful control group. And I just read a paper, and this is another mind blower. There's another sect, the Hutterites. They have all the habits of the Amish, except they use industrial electricity. And this study was of asthma. People noticed that the Amish kids don't get asthma. That's amazing. And it's almost never seen. And the Hutterites get it. Why the Hutterites use electricity, the Amish don't? There's the answer right there. I wrote to the journals. They won't publish it. And when Stetzer and his friends cleaned up a school in Wisconsin, 37 of the kids who used inhalers for asthma tossed them away, and only 3 still needed their inhalers. When you were talking about Mother Nature, let's face it, when the planet cooled down, we were exposed to magnetic field from the Earth's core. It's a static field. We had the Schumann resonances from lightning bouncing off the Van Allen belt, and we had frictional electricity. That's it. And we got cosmic rays coming in from space. All the other stuff that we're exposed to now increasingly is man-made. And what's happened in the last 15, 20 years to really kill us, besides the microwaves, is, and this is a big one, they discovered that, the old electric motors, like all devices, like your fan, had an on-off switch or a high, medium, low. Now they use little electronic doodads called variable frequency drives. You put them on small motors, on huge motors, and they all crap up the electricity. And
Interesting.
They put out terrible stuff. In fact, we got a paper. We identified we studied a cluster of ocular melanoma, a really rare eye cancer in North Carolina, and I'm positive it was caused by a variable frequency drive from a natural gas pumping and purification station, well, right now, my friend Dave Stetzer, he and his wife had to move out of their house because they live in Wisconsin, where they mine this fracking sand, and when they put VFDs on the big motors that run the process, and he's 8 miles from the thing, and it drove him out of his house. He noticed that the fans in his house on the stove were oscillating with frequency. So he got his oscilloscope out and measured it, and it's broken his air conditioner, his hi-fi, and his wife gets tachycardia, and he gets sick to his stomach. I mean, so they're living at a cabin. A guy named John Ott studied kids in a Florida school way back in the 50s, and the kids had ADHD, and he knew it had something to do with the fluorescent lighting. What he did was he put a wire mesh grid in front of the lights and grounded it, and that could protect the kids. I don't think he knew exactly what he was protecting them from, but he did it, and it worked. His book was Health and Light is the name of his book.
A great book. He was a major pioneer. He was, I think he lived down in Florida. He certainly worked for Disney.
Yeah.
They did a lot of pioneering work. An
I,
amazing
I,
man.
I read that book all the time.
So he was an inspiration to you. That's great.
Absolutely. He was right on.
But we can remediate against these fields. Now, and let me go back to some of the potential biological mechanisms, because these fields, these aberrant peaks that come out, if you're within a range, which could be fairly significant, it's certainly more than 10 feet, they're going to resonate with your body, and then they're going to cause some biological effect. And I've seen some research where the suggested mechanism of the health consequences are related to the production of a reactive nitrogen species, not a reactive oxygen species, which is ROS. This is RNS, reactive nitrogen species. It's called peroxynitrate. Right. And are you familiar with that work at all?
Yeah, I am, but I think you could back up, and I think EMF, EMI is a stressor, and if you go into the stress literature, in fact, we did a study showing that we cleaned up the electrical environment, we reduced the stress hormones, and ADHD is caused by we don't have to get technical for your audience, but I think stress is the big common denominator for all this business.
Can you define stress first, because it has many different meanings?
Well, psychological stress, physical stress, thermal stress, electrical stress. I think the endpoint's all the same. Okay. I think you get a flight and fight reaction. Cortisol goes up. The neurotransmitters change. We got a paper I wrote on it, and we actually went into a library that was really dirty, and we measured the neurotransmitters and showed that once we filtered the place, the neurotransmitter levels changed. And there's a wonderful study by Buckner and Egger in Germany. They went into a pristine valley before a cell tower came in, and they showed long-term lasting changes and a whole panoply of hormones that they could measure, including stress hormones.
So I would say the vast majority of the public, maybe as high as 95% or 99%, don't believe this. They don't believe there's any harm or concern here, even though you've compiled a lot of good evidence that suggests otherwise. But of those that do, a fairly significant of the percentage of those population would understand the dangers of microwave radiation. In fact, even the World Health Organization has categorized it as a class 2B carcinogen, which is possible carcinogen. So I'm wondering if you could compare the dangers of the microwave radiation to the dirty electricity, which is a lower frequency.
Well, let me just remind you and the audience that microwaves began with radar in World War II. Okay, radar range, that was the first microwave oven. They called them radar ranges. Well, heck, back in the early 20s and 30s, before microwaves existed, this stuff was killing us like flies. It's the power frequency, it's the grid, it's all the dirty electricity from arcing and sparking and from all the other junk we put into the grid.
But aren't those two separate entities?
No, they're
the same. They're just on the different. They're on the same spectrum, but they're different frequencies. Is that the case?
Different frequencies and different harmonics. I don't think any unnatural radiation is good for you, except sunlight's good. It gives you vitamin D and.
Well, and we have the red and the near infrared, which have many other biological beneficial benefits.
But even Ott showed if you wear pink sunglasses, you got sick, And,
yeah. Well, if you wear them during the daytime when you're out in the sun, if you wear them at night, they may be actually better than the blue blockers, because they also block blue, green, and yellow, which after the sun goes down, we were never exposed to, because the only light that humans have been exposed to for a million years is really that from fire. Which does not have blue, certainly, and has minimal green and orange, or green and yellow.
Yeah, it's amazing. My dream is, I'm 85, I'm not going to be around much more. The utility industry recognized 30 years ago, they said that we could fix this country up health-wise and solve the cow problem by putting a fifth wire up on the grid. to put the neutrals back on the poles and back to the substation. And if we could do that, we could have the kind of health pattern that the Amish have. Their cancer rates are 40% of ours. There's no ADHD. There's very, very little. There's almost no suicide. There's, oh my God, it's just, I figured
well, it would seem that this is a really important part of the solution for all the new solar installations that are going up. They need to put this fifth wire on there. There seems to be an important need for some type of campaign to educate this, because my guess is that it wouldn't be that expensive to install initially. It would certainly be more expensive to retrofit it.
Well, you know, even after the grid's up, they actually studied this, I think, in Michigan or Minnesota. The science advisors, they did a dummy run of how much it would cost to put all the EMI back into the wires, and it came to some trivial, like 12 cents for a typical household. It increased your electric bill by under $1. And they could, in a couple of years, they could have the whole state cleaned up. But you know, utilities, they're just greedy. They don't want to spend their bucks on.
No, they're not much different than any other large corporation, actually. Yeah, they're really similar between the food industry, the drug industry. They've got many similarities. But many times their actions can be motivated by educated and informed consumers who actually vote with their pocketbooks, which is a bit more challenging to do with utility, because usually you only have one utility serving you. You can't have a selection of different utility providers where you can with many of the items that we consume, especially food. But I think a coordinated action on educated consumers could influence them. And it's actually something I'm intrigued and motivated to do, because this is such a pervasive issue. It's needlessly harming most all of us. And
every one of us, all of us.
Well, you can remediate against it, but you know, you're going to go in and be in environments where it's not remediated, but you can, and I'm sure your home is remediated too, but it's only partial. It's not 100%.
You know, one of my favorite places is a local farmer's market here. And last year I was horrified to find out that just walking or standing in that place, I was putting, 200 microamps of current into my body just by virtue of the.
Well, I love this concept, because anyone watching this can do this experiment. Now, so can you run it by us again? Because you said you put one of the electrodes under your tongue to ground it, but where are you going to put the ground if you're at the farmer's market? I mean, because I
got a long wire. Mm-hmm. I plug in either to an available plug. The little round thing is the ground plug. I went to a hardware store and I fabricated a plug that just has the ground attached. So I plug into that, and short of that, I have 50 feet of wire. I can drive a stake into the ground off the premises, and that's a true ground. And I compare that to the utility ground, and they're pretty close. So so
you could just stick a stake in the ground and do it that way.
Yeah, well, I went under a 500 kV line, and there's no outlets there. I just drove a stake in the ground, and I made measurements of magnetic field and body current just to see how they compared.
And what did you find when you under that 500
kV? They're both high, obviously.
No surprise, but how high were they relative to the other?
Well, what I found was interesting is the magnetic field, as you got away from the line, stayed high, higher than. In other words, it didn't drop off as fast as the body current, which is good news.
Okay. But anyway, when people measure this, what would be considered a healthy or normal body current?
Well, body current, you want to keep it under 18.
18
microamps.
18
microamps.
Microamps. Okay. And the higher it is, the worse it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So under and what about the voltage? How many millivolts?
Voltage, I've done some voltage comparisons. You can actually if you have an oscilloscope tracing, you can voltage equals V equals IR. it equals current times resistance. You can assume the resistance of the human being is 500 ohms. So if you know the amperage and the resistance, you can figure what the voltage is. You can do it the other way. So if I take an oscilloscope tracing of a place, I might come up with, say, 100 millivolts. Well, I can divide that, multiply that by 500 or just double it, and that gives me an estimate of what the amperage is, and it's almost close. First time I did it, I came out, observed 270. I would have expected 290 microamps. So I know it works.
Okay, and again, that 270 is significantly higher than the 18 microamps itself.
Wow! Oh wow!
Do you ever get into milliamps where it's that high?
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, in the down grounds, in the development right near the school I studied in California, it's not just the school; it's that whole swath of that part of the town. There's a Boys and Girls Club. There's an elementary school. There's a YMCA daycare. They're all off scale for this, and there's a development adjoining to it where there's cancer like every house in that block. And I measured the down grounds and the power poles in the backyards, and I got up in the milliamps there.
Wow. So you would expect lots of problems. Now, what's more dangerous, the higher amperage or higher voltage, or obviously they're connected through the formula?
They go together. I think I wrote a little letter which hasn't been published yet, but I think we've been measuring the wrong thing in all these epi studies for the last 40 years. We've been measuring, because I find plenty of places where the body current, amperage of my body, is higher than a kite, and the Gauss meters and the other meters that we traditionally used don't show anything.
Yeah, well, they're measuring the magnetic field, which is another
they measure electric field too.
Oh, they do?
They don't have the bandwidth. That's the problem.
Okay. So there really, as far as you know, other than sort of rigging this up yourself, there's no commercial device that is designed to measure body fields.
Well, no, it wasn't designed, but you can buy an off-the-shelf fluke.
Yeah, they're not expensive.
They cost like $300-400.
Yeah.
And it's a in fact, Marty Graham got mine off eBay, had a guy's name on it.
And what, if one wanted one of these meters, what would they be looking for? Does it have to have an output or a section of a wire that will go to ground? Because most of them have.
Oh no, the thing comes with everything you need. All you got to do is fabricate and take a wire, 12-gauge wire, and put a three-prong plug on it where you've got you only contact the round plug.
Sure, the ground.
And that you attach to your black electrode. Okay. That's for your ground. And the red one goes to your EKG patch on your chest or to your mouth.
Or in your mouth, yeah. Oh, perfect. And you're set.
You push a button and you read it.
Yeah, I think you can get them for less than 300. I think I've seen them right.
Well, to get the exact one on my website,
what is your website, Ken?
It's called. You just go to Google and type Sam Milham dirty electricity.
Okay.
It'll come up. And I got papers on there, and the paper it's called contact current. I measured contact current in showers. People in California were getting sick in their showers, and the implanted cardioverters were malfunctioning. And I found out that the ground current, when you're wet, you're a lot more conductive in the shower, and you touch the shower handle, you're getting all the garbage that's running through the ground into your body. So I made measurements, and it's high.
Now, have you ever measured your body current when you were under a Faraday cage?
No. Well, no. I can interrupt it. If I got a fluorescent light in my bathroom, which I keep. If I get my hand close to it, I get really high body amperage. If I put a grounded wire screen between me and the light, it goes away.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. I was not aware that. I'm a massive proponent for not using fluorescent lights, but for different reasons. I thought it was just the light emitted. I didn't realize that it transferred amperage into your body. I had no idea.
Let me take it one step further. Years ago, I studied a tanning salon because you lay on fluorescent bulbs. That's how the beds work. So I got thinking, oh wow, I'm going to measure my body amperage in one of these. So I did, but it's not that much higher than the poor girl who sits at the intake taking your money, and she's exposed to fluorescent lights on a slanting wall about 15 feet away. She had body amperage almost as high as you get on a tanning bed.
Interesting.
And my barber shop's the same way. She got 8 6-bulb units, and when I measured this, I had her shut the lights off. It all goes away. So she's getting fried all day, every day.
So, I mean, folks, this is just another reason why you do not want fluorescent lights in your house.
LEDs too.
I couldn't agree more. Just from the biological component of a light, not even the electrical component, which I was clueless about until now. So
I went to a lighting store. I took my junk into a lighting store before they were wise to me. I spent 3 hours measuring every light in a place, and almost every one was bad. LEDs, all the fluorescents were bad. The CFLs were super bad. And let me give you a final anecdote. When Stetzer did the cow study, a lot of the dairies kept the oscilloscopes in place. And he got a call from one of them who had the oscilloscope in place, complaining that all of a sudden their milk production went way down. So Dave went out there and looked at the scope, and the only thing they did was they put in 2 brand new 6-bulb fluorescent lights, and that was it. We pulled them out and pulled them back and measured them in his office, and he's finally he fabricated a clean LED of all things by, you know how he just measured the crap, and he bought tuned filters. You can take care of most of this stuff.
Yeah, if you believe that it's an issue, and the obvious problem is that most of these companies are clueless about it, and even if they were aware of it, they're not willing to spend the extra money to remediate it.
It's not only clueless. The National Electric Safety Code tells the utilities that they cannot use the earth as a primary neutral return. The California PUD and most California public utility districts and commissions have laws, rules, regs. They're just violated willy-nilly. They just do it. Period.
So that to me would seem to be a perfect opportunity to initiate a class action lawsuit against the utility for violating the existing regulations.
Exactly. But you know, you can't get attorneys to handle this. They don't understand it. And right now I'm helping a poor guy in Tennessee who has a trailer park, and they put a microwave antenna on his property, a SCADA, this communication device to take their smart meter data back for billing purposes. And he's sick. Everybody's sick. I went down and measured it. It's horrible. There's no place to hide anymore.
Yeah.
It's
well,
discouraging.
You've been a real pioneer out there, and you've been taking the arrows in the back. You really have. And you know, when I read your book, I just resonated with so much because I could see my own experience. And when you're bringing these controversial information to the public, there's this massive effort from the offended or affected corporate interest to discredit you, to take you down, to have, invest significant resources to demonize you and make you appear like you're a flake.
Exactly.
And you've done this. They've been doing this for you the last 2 decades or longer.
Yeah, for forever.
yeah, a long time. So, and yet you persist. So, because obviously you're passionate about this, you're driven, and you went into this field for the right reasons. And you maintained your integrity, which is something we don't typically see in many professionals.
Well, not just that, but I mean, how exciting is it? 50, 60 years ago, I had intuition about what was going on, and the more I worked, the more, hey, wow, it's great to know you're right. But I wish I could get the government. But I lived through smoking.
Yes, that's right, you did.
I lived through asbestos. It took 50, 60 years. So when I'm in my grave, people are going to look back and say, God, Milham was right. Why didn't we listen to him?
Yeah, well, and there's another pioneer similar to you. I think he's passed now. His name is Claire Peterson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was the innovative researcher who really brought to light the damages and the dangers of lead in gasoline. We had known for centuries that it was a neurotoxin, yet in the early 1900s they were put into gasoline, but it took someone like Claire Peterson to do the research. He actually went to got ice from the Arctic and showed that there was these massive differences. Then he finally believed it, but they still have this massive discrediting campaign against it. But he changed it, and now lead's out. And I think, as similar with your efforts, maybe after you pass, that this will happen. But I wasn't aware of these details, and I'm really interested and going to seriously evaluate some campaigns that we can initiate to get this remediated, because it's a relatively simple process, and I have no problems investing significant resources to get this thing made right.
Oh, the latest is really exciting. It looks from our work that the cancers are frequency specific. Mm-hmm. And the specific frequency causes specific cancers. And, Dave Stetzer told me the Russians knew this. They weaponized in in the Cold War, they wiped out some of our ambassadors. And it wasn't when microwaves. It was supposed to be the Russian embassy got microwaved. You can't run microwave through big rebar walls. They ran it in through the electric mains. They put dirty electricity of the right frequencies, and they knew which ones did it. And they gave these people leukemia.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. And I believe that not all the countries in the world are as foolish, I think that's the best term, as the U.S. And aren't many of the countries like Russia and Germany, don't they understand this issue and they're remediating and they don't have the EMI in their electrical system?
Well, yeah, they got a big advantage. They got a Delta system. Their system is built so that all the returns go back on the wires. The other thing they have is tighter EMI rules, like this plant and that caused the ocular melanoma cluster. They couldn't get away with that in Europe. Stetzer told me that when he looks at these variable frequency drives, they usually have machine studs on them for the filter to go on, but the filter is optional in this country. So they're not optional in Europe, And so
it isn't funny, obviously, but it's not surprising, but it's just so sickeningly sad that corporate greed has allowed the expansion and the progression of so many of these diseases. It's a primary contributing factor. There's no doubt in my mind. And regardless of the mechanism, I believe it's primarily mediated through optimizing mitochondrial function or unoptimizing or causing mitochondrial dysfunction. That its biological effects are mediated through. So it's sad though.
Want to have some fun? I put all my new papers on my website and PDFs. You got to read some of those; they'll blow your mind.
I will.
Scratched into that. I'd be glad to talk to you again if you have any other questions.
I am definitely going to keep your content information in my Rolodex file, no question, because you are an expert in it. It would be what I call BF, beyond foolish, to not utilize you as a resource. You spent decades understanding this. You've got knowledge that took you this long amount of time to acquire, and it's crazy not to access and utilize it. And I look forward to working with you in the future on this. So I couldn't recommend more strongly to pick up a copy of your book, Dirty Electricity. You can get it on Amazon for $3 as a Kindle version, which is how I read it. And it's a relatively quick read, but it's very engaging. You wrote it yourself, and it's almost like an autobiography, because you don't just go into dirty electricity. You talk about your journey, which sort of reinforces the validity of your observations, because it really shows the type of person that you are. So I really thank you for writing that book. And I think if you have any doubt, I couldn't encourage anyone to pick up a copy. Obviously, you're not making a lot of money at $3 a copy, or you can get your papers that you just type in your name, Sam Milham, and Dirty Electricity, and you'll come up to your website and there's papers you can download. So it's a great resource. And I really want to thank you for your years of pioneering work and sticking in there and really persevering through the discrediting campaigns that industry has hurled at you.
I'm not done yet.
That's great. That is just great. That's so good to hear. So good to hear, because we need guys like you around. There's no question.